Hello and welcome to Engineering Ethics at NJIT. I'm your instructor, Daniel Estrada, and this is the lecture video for Lesson 7, Ethical Codes. Let's jump into the lesson. Alright, so this is Lesson 7. Lesson 7 is sort of a breaking point to the next unit of the course. We're done, really, with the introduction of our major ethical theories and some of the key ethical concepts like integrity they're going to be using for the rest of the semester. So from this point forward, we're mostly going to be doing case studies that apply what we've learned so far to specific cases that might be relevant to your future careers. In Lesson 7, we're going to be focusing on the NSPE Code of Ethics in some detail. We've looked at this a few times already at the fundamental canons and some of the language in the Code of Ethics, but this week we're going to do some more detailed analysis of the first few parts of the Code of Ethics. Your assignment this lesson is a little bit different from previous assignments. In particular, it's not a free writing assignment. So in normal lessons, you can write about whatever you want. But in this lesson, I'm asking that you do something specific. In particular, I'm asking that you go to the archives of the Board of Ethical Review, that you look at one of their case studies, something since 1980. They do about 12 case studies every year, so there's plenty for you to choose from since 1980. But select a case study that's interesting to you, read it over, and give it a good ethical analysis. So you can't write about just anything you want. I want you to write about one of these case studies in the archives of the Board of Ethical Review. I'll give you some more details about exactly what I'm expecting for your assignment this lesson, but the structure should be the same. It's a regular post and 2 replies as usual for a discussion forum. There's also a quiz this week. Your quiz will be a short paragraph response, something like what you did in Lesson 5. This one will be about the BART case, which is discussed in Chapter 6 of your textbook. There's also an extra credit opportunity in Lesson 7 that'll be due in a few weeks from now, and I will give you details on those assignments at the end of this video. Alright, so we're going to talk about the NSPE Code of Ethics. Let me just give you a little bit of background on the NSPE. This is the National Society of Professional Engineers. It's a professional engineering society. Most professional engineers are members of this society. It registers and licenses engineers in 52 states and territories. There's 500 chapters. The NSPE is one of the professional societies responsible for handing out issuing the licenses and working with government boards to figure out the requirements for these licenses. So the NSPE works with governments and public institutions for the sake of engineers in order to represent engineering interests and the interests of engineers generally. They work with regulators on licensing requirements, on safety standards. They are consulted when there's possibilities of ethical violations, and we'll see some of that play out in just a bit. They also produce the Code of Ethics. This Code of Ethics has been around for a while. So the NSPE was formed in 1934. They produce a regular newsletter, and in their annual newsletter in 1946, where it was like Christmas, it was towards the end of the year, 1946. They published the canons, the fundamental canons, as an ethical code, and this was just sort of published in the publication of the NSPE. And it was a lot of engineers were confused about the canons, exactly how to interpret the rules, what do they mean in specific situations. And so in the 50s, the Board of Ethical Review was set up to analyze specific cases and give the Code of Ethics a sort of formal treatment so that it's more clear how those rules apply in particular circumstances. The Board of Ethical Review gave these case studies for several years, and then in 1964 there was a vote among the members where the Code of Ethics was formally adopted by the NSPE. In the time since, the Board of Ethical Review meets every year, twice a year actually, to discuss a set of cases and then put them in the archives to go over ethical issues, and especially as the technologies and the business changes. updating these case studies to reflect the challenges that engineers currently face. So the most recent set in the archive is from 2016, I believe. I don't think the 2017 reviews are in yet, but so they're pretty up to date. There's some relatively new kinds of ethical issues talked about recently. The other thing to emphasize with the NSPE Code of Ethics, it's a living document. It undergoes revisions regularly, sometimes substantial revisions. The most important recent revision was in the 70s. In 1976, the U.S. government sued the NSPE, citing antitrust laws. So there used to be a clause in the NSPE Code of Ethics against competitive bidding. The NSPE Code of Ethics used to have a clause saying that engineers will not bid against other professional engineers, and the idea was that this is supposed to protect the profession, to make sure that you're not putting other engineers out of work, that you're not driving prices down, that force engineers to cut costs maybe unnecessarily or in ways that maybe put the public at risk, right? In order to protect the profession of engineering, the Code of Ethics before 1976 had clauses against competitive bidding, that you weren't allowed to bid against other engineers. But the U.S. decided that this constituted a trust violation against the Sherman Act. So the NSPE sued the U.S. sued the NSPE to take this clause was anti-competitive. The U.S. won this lawsuit. It went to the Supreme Court, and the U.S. won this lawsuit. And so the NSPE had to take out all the language that restricted competitive biddings in the code. And that means that the rulings from the Board of Review before the 70s are really different from the ones after. And this is why I have that cutoff of the 1980s, because I want to make sure that the legal framework and legal perspective reflected in the Board of Ethical Review cases is up to date and current. The last revision for the online document was in 2007, so that's not exactly recent up to date, but it's a document that changes over time, and it changes in response to the conditions that engineers face. Right, so this isn't written in stone. This isn't some sacred document. This is something that the Professional Society of Engineers constantly think about and update as needed. Okay, so let's go over some of this. A document like this usually starts with something like a preamble. The preamble is really about motivating the reasons for the document and what it hopes to prove, the perspective that the document's coming from. So the preamble to the NSPE Code of Ethics, I'm just going to read it because it's short. Engineering is an important and learned profession. As members of this profession, engineers are expected to exhibit the highest standards of honesty and integrity. Engineering has a direct and vital impact on the quality of life for all people. Accordingly, services provided by engineers require honesty, impartiality, fairness, and equity, and must be dedicated to the protection of the public health, safety, and welfare. Engineers must perform under a standard of professional behavior that requires adherence to the highest principles of ethical conduct. And then there's the canons. Canons is your attendance password this lesson. We've looked at these canons before, but I'm just going to read them again for the sake of thoroughness. So engineers in the fulfillment of their professional duties shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public, perform services only in areas of their competence, issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner, act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees, avoid deceptive acts, and conduct themselves honorably, responsibly, and ethically and lawfully so as to enhance the honor, reputation, and usefulness of the profession. Right, so this concern about the profession shows up even in the canons. A lot of discussion about deceptive acts, acting as a faithful trustee, an agent, issuing statements in an objective and truthful manner. Lots of concern about honesty. Honesty is mentioned explicitly in the preamble, honesty, impartiality, fairness. One nice review you might want to do is think about how the preamble and the canons reflect consequentialist reasoning, deontological reasoning, virtue ethics reasoning. I'll leave that as an exercise to the reader. But I think you can find examples of all of these kinds of reasonings in these passages. Again, underlining the point that all of these theoretical perspectives are useful in a unified framework, right? So it's not that consequentialists see engineering ethics one way and deontologists see it another way, but it's really that all of these ethical perspectives contribute something to the ethical discussion and are reflected in the Code of Ethics for the NSPE. All right, so part 1 of the NSPE is the fundamental canons, and then part 2 has sections that really just elaborate on each one of the fundamental canons. So these are the rules of practice. I'm going to go over these, some of these in detail. But so again, number 1 is engineers shall hold paramount to safety, health, and welfare of the public. And then there's some sort of explanations of exactly what that means. That includes things like notifying employer or client or other such a thing as may be appropriate in situations where circumstances endanger life or property. Right? That there's an obligation to notify authorities as appropriate. This might, in fact, require whistleblowing. This is sort of encoded in the NSPE Code of Ethics. Another interesting thing about holding paramount the health, safety, and welfare of the public. So, I mean, it says things like only approve engineering documents that are in conformity with applicable standards, don't reveal facts or information of a client without prior consent, and so on. But D here is interesting. It says that you shall not permit the use that engineers shall not permit the use of their name or associate in business ventures with any person or firm they believe is engaged in fraudulent or dishonest enterprise. So again, this is about, and this is a recurring theme in the Code of Ethics, that the engineers have an obligation not just to do the right thing in the abstract, not just for the safety, health, and welfare of the public, but also for the reputation of engineering in general, and to make sure that engineering is an honorable profession. And part of what that means is that it's not enough just to do the right thing, but it also requires that you appear that you're doing the right thing, that you present an image of someone with integrity, right? Right. So someone might do the right thing, but it might look like they cheated, and so it might be questionable, or or it might look like they cheated or broke a law or did something wrong or immoral. Even if they didn't cheat, the appearance of cheating is something that tarnishes the reputation of that engineer and maybe of engineering generally. And so the Code of Ethics over and over again emphasizes that it's for engineers not just to do the right thing, but to provide the appearance of doing the right thing. And this is the first sort of example of this. You're not allowed to associate with people that you know are engaged in fraudulent or dishonest activity. So imagine that you have a friend in an engineering firm, and you know that firm is doing something illegal, is dumping chemical waste in the river or whatever. So you know they're doing something wrong, maybe harmful to public health and safety. And maybe your firm is engaged in a business venture with this other firm. Even if your business with that firm doesn't involve any of the regulations or safety violations that firm is engaged in, if you know them to be engaged in that unlawful or unsafe activity, then you have an obligation, even if you're not directly involved with that illegal or unsafe activity, you have an obligation to disassociate yourself with the company that's doing that unsafe or illegal activity, in order to make sure that it's clear that you're not associating with fraudulent activity. Or even if you are absolutely clear and certain that you're not involved with that activity, you have an obligation to disassociate, to not engage in shared projects with companies you know to be engaged in fraudulent or dishonest activity. So that's interesting. And we'll see this over and over again. Okay, so this is number 1. Number 2, engineers shall only perform services in their area of competence. Right, so part of the reason that there's a high ethical standard on engineers is because engineers have specialized technical knowledge. They have expertise in an area that the general public doesn't have. And so the general public is dependent on engineers in order to build our bridges and design our cities and so on. If we can't trust the engineering profession to do that in the public's interest, then that is bad for everyone, engineers and the public alike. So it's important that engineers use their privileged knowledge responsibly, and this is why there's these high ethical standards. Right? This is why it's not enough for the engineer to just do the right thing. They also have to provide the appearance of doing the right thing, because it's not just the engineer. It's not just the engineer's actions at stake. It's the profession the entire profession that's at stake. So engineers should only perform in their area of competence. That means that if you're not competent to perform some activity, then you shouldn't do it. You shouldn't sign off on material that you are not qualified to sign off on, that you're not prepared to control and be responsible for. Right? If you don't have the proper training, the proper certifications, or whatever, in order to, the proper license in order to perform some action or engage in some project, then you can't do it. And this goes for things like, I know from the archive of the NSPE Code of Ethics, there's cases where an engineer is licensed in one state, but then goes to another state, maybe to visit someone, and gives some engineering advice about a project they're doing. Giving engineering advice as a professional engineer in a state where you're not licensed is a kind of violation of this Rule 2, where you're performing services outside of your area of competence. The regulations and policies differ from state to state, and if you're not licensed in that state, then maybe you don't know all the details of the policies that might apply to some particular project, in which case you're not competent to be giving that advice, in which case you probably shouldn't be doing it. Now, there is an exception to this, which is that in many large projects, there's a lead engineer who has the license and is in charge of the project generally. But that engineer has subordinates who control the details of specific parts of the project, and it might be that the detailed sub-project is outside of the lead engineer's main area of competence. So maybe the lead engineer is not themselves competent in the specialty task required of some sub-project. That's okay, and the lead engineer can sign off on the project entirely, as long as, and it says here, engineers may accept assignments and assume responsibility for coordination of an entire project and sign and seal engineering documents for the entire project, provided that each technical segment is signed and sealed only by the qualified engineers who prepared that segment. So lead engineer doesn't have to be the expert for all the technical segments, as long as there is a technical expert for each of those segments who can sign off and be responsible for those segments. Then the lead engineer can sign off on the entire project. So it's the lead engineer's responsibility to make sure that someone who can legitimately be responsible for those segments is in a position to sign off on them. All right, let's keep going. Number 3, engineer shall issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner. Again, this is one of these canons. In this, there's another part of this obligation that engineers have to uphold the profession, the honor of the profession. So there's a discussion about engineers providing expert testimony, or providing expert statements when necessary for the public's interest. It also talks about engineers expressing technical opinions that are founded on knowledge of the facts and competence. So engineers have a higher obligation to perform ethically because they're technical experts in a domain where the public is dependent on their technical expertise. And for this reason, engineers are encouraged by the Code of Ethics to express their technical opinions publicly, to inform the public. We'll see this, especially in the last section. But engineers are encouraged to share their technical knowledge generally, widely, help inform the public about the details of the engineering world around them, and make sure that when you do so, you're doing it truthfully, that you're competent to do so, and so on. Sometimes, however, engineers are asked to be paid spokespersons for certain projects. Maybe there's a bridge going up, and maybe the engineer is asked by the local news radio program to give an interview about the bridge and the impact it'll have on the traffic, on the river, on whatever. The engineer, so engineers can give these kinds of interviews. Any general engineer can give this kind of interview if they're competent to speak on the technical issues. But a paid engineer is also able to give these kinds of statements in public interviews, as long as, and the Code of Ethics makes clear, as long as they have prefaced their comments by explicitly identifying the interested parties on whose behalf they are speaking, and by revealing the existence of any interest the engineers may have in the matter. Right? So if you're being paid by the company building the bridge, and you're giving an interview about the bridge, then it's important that you make sure that the interviewer and the general public knows that you are a paid representative of that company. Because knowing that you're a paid representative it might have influence over what you say. It might dispose you to distort the truth in various ways. And so to make sure that the public is well informed and properly interpreting what you say, it's important that you reveal any other interests you might have. So if you're being paid by that company, that's a potential conflict of interest. And it's okay that so that potential conflict of interest doesn't mean that you can't talk publicly about these issues. It just means that you have to be explicit about that interest. So if you're a paid representative, then say that you're a paid representative. And if you're not a paid representative, then also say that you're not a paid representative. That will give the public some insight into how to interpret what you say. Again, a lot of this is informed by the motivation to uphold the honor of the profession. Right, number 4, engineers shall act for each employer or client as faithful agents and trustees. And here again, we have this idea of the appearance of conflict. So I've used this term a couple of times, conflict of interest. Let me go ahead and define it. A conflict of interest is a set of circumstances that create a risk that professional judgment or action regarding a primary interest will be unduly influenced by a secondary interest. Right? So you have a conflict of interest if you're on some project where you're committed to two different parties or two different interests that might have competing or conflicting perspectives on the project that you're engaged in. So you have an ethical obligation to avoid or at least disclose any potential conflicts of interest. So having a conflict of interest doesn't prevent you from doing some things. Like I said in the last slide, you can still do an interview if you have a conflict of interest, as long as you explicitly disclose that conflict. Disclosing it, keeps things honest, keeps things everything above the table. So engineers shall disclose all known or potential conflicts of interest that could influence or appear to influence their judgment or the quality of their services. And here again is this appearance of influence that matters. It's not just enough that you have no conflict of interest or that you believe that the conflict of interest isn't unduly influencing your judgment. If there appears to be a conflict of interest, that's enough to require to present some ethical obligations on what you have to do, right? So, it's not enough that you just do the right thing. You also have to make sure that you appear to do the right thing so that everyone knows what's going on. Maybe let me show up here and give a little background. As an undergraduate, I tutored at my university, University of California, Riverside. It's a state school, so I was a state employee. And the rule for state employees, I'm a state employee now, the rule for me now is also we're not allowed to accept gifts. And the reason you're not allowed to accept gifts is because it might create a conflict of interest, especially if someone's giving you gifts, you might give them special treatment. As a teacher, if one of the students in my courses was giving me a bunch of gifts, maybe to try to get an A in class, that presents a conflict of interest. And even if I know that I'm not going to change my grade, you can give me all the chocolate you want, I'm not going to change the grade. But accepting the chocolate at all, even if it has no influence on what your grade ends up being, it might appear that way to other students in the class. Maybe other students see me getting the chocolate and they suspect that the grades are being swayed from getting chocolate. And from that, they might believe that I'm unfairly favoring some students over others, and that appearance of wrongdoing is an ethical violation. So I have to refuse that gift, no matter how much I want it, and no matter how certain I am that I'm not doing anything wrong when I take that gift. Just the taking the gift itself might appear to be doing the wrong thing. It might appear as a conflict of interest, and so it requires either disclosure or just refusing. I'm not allowed as a state employee. I'm not allowed to take any gifts of any size, really. But the reason I come on screen is because I have like a personal story about this again. I was a tutor, and I worked with a student for several years as a tutor. He was a computer science major, and I helped him in his math classes and his computer science classes. And some of those classes he would have had a hard time passing if we hadn't worked very hard together in the tutoring lounge. We worked together for several years, for 3 years, I think. And then he was graduating. Because it was a university service, he never paid for, he at least never paid me for using tutoring services. I was being paid by the university, and he was getting access to the tutoring services by his tuition. So there was never any exchange of money between him and me. But once he graduated, he was graduating. He had passed all his classes. He was prepared to walk, and he wanted to show appreciation to me. So he gave me a gift card, a Best Buy gift card for $100. Which is it's not a ton of money. It's a nice gesture. He wasn't obviously trying to influence me to change his grades or anything like that. I didn't have control of his grades, first of all, and second of all, he was about to graduate, so there was no further kind of influence or conflict that might exist there. I didn't know about it at the time, and I don't remember taking a lot of. Or I think we did take state ethics tests, but I don't remember the policy at the time, and I remember I accepted the gift. But I think now that I shouldn't have accepted that gift, that even if it seemed harmless, I should have turned that gift down because of the appearance of improper influence. If another student had seen that exchange, they might have gotten the idea that I was giving favorable treatment to this student over other students, and that would have been a conflict of interest. So this is a mistake that I made. It's an example I remember every time we go over this discussion. Getting gifts might create a conflict of interest. You have to turn down gifts if it creates these conflicts of interest. Sometimes you hear people talk about that there's like a $20 rule, that if it's under $20 it doesn't count. But as far as I know, that those rules aren't true. It's not true that there's a dollar limit. So even small gifts might create a potential conflict of interest. There are exceptions to this. So you can accept things like coffee and donuts before a meeting. That doesn't count as a gift. But if it's something like a branded mug, or tickets to the Super Bowl or whatever, those are the kind of gifts that you can't accept, or that might create a conflict of interest, especially for a state employee. So I can't accept those kind of gifts as a state employee, and a lot of these restrictions really involve business interactions with government or quasi-governmental employees, which create special concerns, especially special concerns in the public interest. Right, so businesses might be able to engage in certain kinds of privileged interactions between each other that are not illegal, but when one of those parties is a government employee, then it changes a lot of the rules about what counts as a conflict of interest. One special case of this is Spiro Agnew. Your textbook talks about Spiro Agnew a little bit. Spiro Agnew was President Nixon's vice president. And Spiro Agnew actually resigned before Nixon resigned. Because this had nothing to do with the Watergate scandal. It was a completely different scandal. Spiro Agnew was discovered having accepted bribes in order to issue contracts through the White House. So he was issuing no bid contracts to his friends in order to make sure that his friends made money, using his privileged position as vice president to Richard Nixon. He was caught. When he was caught, he resigned from office. He was a lawyer. Spiro Agnew, I don't think he was an engineer. I think he was a politician, but I think he had a law degree, and he was disbarred as a result of this scandal. And the judge who disbarred him called him morally obtuse. It's a good example of no bid contracts. It's a good example of sort of the ethical violations that result from conflicts of interest, especially with state employees or government employees. So this is kind of a deceptive act that the Code of Ethics explicitly says you're not allowed to be involved with. In particular, engineers should not offer, give, receive, solicit or receive, either directly or indirectly, any contribution to influence the award of a contract by a public authority, or which may be reasonably construed by the public as having the effect or intent of influencing the award of the contract. This is reasonably construed by the public. You're not allowed to even have the appearance of trying to influence the awarding of contracts by the public. Spiro Agnew's major ethical violation. These kinds of contract violation or ethical violations about public contracts. It's common. A lot of the Board of Ethical Review cases concern these kinds of situations. All right, so that's the second section of the NSPE Code of Ethics. The third section goes over different professional obligations. It lists 9 professional obligations that engineers have: that they should be guided by honesty and integrity, that they should serve the public interest, that they should avoid deceiving the public, that they should not disclose sensitive information for their clients or employers. They shouldn't be influenced by conflicts of interest. They should not attempt to obtain employment or advancement or professional engagement by untruthfully criticizing other engineers or by other improper or questionable methods. Let me actually point out a couple of the details here. Yeah, so being guided by honesty and integrity, you shouldn't attempt to attract an engineer to your business with false or misleading pretenses. There's lots of famous cases even in the news right now. The Uber Waymo case involves attracting engineers, stealing data from the other client. Right, these are serious violations of the serious breaches of ethics. Engineers shall strive at all times to serve public interest. They're encouraged to extend public knowledge. And appreciation of engineering and its achievements. Right. So again, this is engineers are encouraged to spread their knowledge widely. Maybe this is too small for you to read. There's details here. I encourage you to read all of the Code of Ethics in detail. This is basically the rest of it. So it's only a couple of pages long. Some of it is very interesting. It gives you some perspective on how the profession thinks about ethics. More details. In passage 6 here, engineers should not attempt to obtain employment by criticizing other engineers or by other improper or questionable methods. You shouldn't slander other engineers. Also, in this section, it says that engineers shall not use office facilities or equipment or laboratory supplies of an employer or carry them out to some outside practice. So, don't steal paper clips, don't steal lab chemicals for your own use in other projects. If they're your employers, they have to be used for the employers. Right? These sort of basic ethical guidelines should be fairly clear, straightforward. Yeah, so engineers who believe others are guilty of unethical or illegal practices shall present such information to the proper authority for action, that engineers have an obligation to take action when they know that something's wrong. Here, number 8 of professional obligations, Engineers shall not use their association with a non-engineer, a corporation, or a partnership as a cloak for unethical acts. This is an explicit restriction against the Nuremberg defense. It's not enough that your corporation or partnership told you to do something, or it was in the business interests of the corporation for you to do something, right? These kinds of excuses can't be used as a cloak for unethical acts. They don't protect you from those acts. You're still responsible for what you do, even if you're doing it in the interest of your employer. Number 9 is give credit for engineering work to those who deserve the credit. Whenever possible, use the names of engineers whose work you're using. Make sure to give credit where credit's due. So I've just briefly mentioned these. I encourage you to go through these in a lot more detail, and very likely the case studies you're going to be looking at will go over these in some more detail. So this is the slide from the beginning of the slideshow, just looking at the lesson plan for this week. So I just want to remind you about your requirements for this lesson. You have to write a post. Your post should be normal length, 450 plus words. And your job is to look at one of the cases from the archive of the Board of Ethical Review. Again, make sure it's from 1980 to the present. And I'm asking that in your post that you make sure to give a clickable hyperlink. So it should be a link that I can click on to check the case that you're using. So make sure you link to the PDF. But then your assignment is to write a normal length post about the case study that you've chosen. So explain the case itself in your own words. The case study, we'll see in a second, the case study has its own description of the case, but I want you to describe the case in your own words, so don't just copy and paste the description from the PDF. If you do that, you're just going to fail. It counts as plagiarism, so you're just going to fail the assignment. So describe the case in your own words, and then describe the Board of Ethical Review's interpretation of the case. So they usually have a page or two where they discuss the case, they discuss the ethical details of the case. They link it back to other prior cases that they've considered, these kinds of things, right? So discuss the board's discussion of the case. And then the board gives a ruling of the case. They give a final conclusion where they say whether the person has violated the ethical code or not. So explain why the board decided the case the way they did, and then whether you agree or disagree with that conclusion. I'd also like you to say a little bit about whether you expect to encounter a case like this in your own professional life. Is it the kind of thing that you think is common in the engineering world? Is it a rare case that you don't expect to see very often? Is it one of these superhero cases that DeGeorge was worried about so much? Everyday case that we really have to be on guard against in our everyday professional lives. Those are the requirements for your lesson. For your post this lesson. I'm also asking that you, if you want an A, if you want to go sort of above and beyond the difference between the 45 points and 50 points on the post. If you want to go above and beyond, maybe give the case an ethical analysis from the perspective of consequentialism, deontology, and or virtue ethics. The NSPE Code of Ethics doesn't really care about the ethical theories very much, so they don't talk about these explicit theoretical perspectives. So if you give some theoretical analysis of the case that you're discussing, that'll sort of boost your score a little bit. Before I talk about the extra credit, let me go ahead and go over some of these review board cases. Again, you have to use one of the 1980 to present cases. The entire archive is here at this link. Again, the Board of Ethical Review is made up of 7 licensed engineers from the membership of the NSPE. They're appointed by the president, so they're not voted into office or anything. They're just appointed every year by the president. The group meets twice a year to decide a collection of cases. They do about 12 cases a year. The point is to provide some interpretation and analysis for hypothetical cases, but that are commonly found in engineering contexts. So the cases aren't real, but they're based on, or they're grounded in the kinds of cases that you're very likely to encounter. Or maybe not very likely to encounter, but that come up in engineering environments, and that require some analysis. The Board of Ethical Review picks cases that sort of extend the analysis that they've already done for other cases in order to confront, in order to deal with new technologies, in order to deal with new sort of regulations or business situations that might arise that are novel, these kinds of things. They also draw connections between the current case and previous cases they've analyzed. And what this does is it creates a body of precedent. So in an actual case of ethical violation, in the legal case, or in the if there's a hearing to see if an engineer's license is revoked, the hearing or the trial might involve an appeal to the Board of Ethical Review cases, case studies as examples of how the profession interprets the ethical obligations on engineers. Now, that said, the Board of Ethical Review doesn't have any legal authority, right? They're not putting people in jail. All the cases they're considering are purely hypothetical, but it serves as precedent for real policy, real regulations, licensing requirements, and so on. So I want to look at just a couple of these cases, so you just get a feel for how they work. This is case 90.4. If you click on this link, you'll get to the PDF. Remember, in your post, I want you to put a hyperlink that I can click on to check the PDF. So this is an example. This is case 94. This is the fourth case they decided in 1990. This case is about the misrepresentation of firm staff. So let me just read the facts of the case really quickly. An engineer X is employed by firm Y, a medium-sized engineering consulting firm controlled by engineer Z. Engineer X is one of the few engineers in firm Y with expertise in hydrology, but the firm's work in the field of hydrology does not constitute a significant percentage of the firm's work. So the engineer knows about hydrology, but the firm doesn't do much hydrology work. The engineer X, an associate with the firm, gives 2 weeks' notice of her intention to move to another firm. Thereafter, engineer Z, a principal in firm Y, continues to distribute a brochure identifying engineer X as an employee of the firm and lists engineer X on the firm's resume. So engineer X does hydrology. She doesn't do very much work for the firm in hydrology, but it's one of the things that's listed on the firm's pamphlet, on their brochure that they hand out to potential clients. The pamphlet identifies engineer X as an employee of the firm and that she's an expert in hydrology. But the engineer X has announced her 2 weeks' notice, and she intends to move to another firm. She gives her 2 weeks' notice as customary, right? So she's properly informed her employer that she's moving on to another firm. But the firm continues to distribute the brochure that lists her as an employee. And so the case here, the ethical question is it ethical for engineer Z to continue to represent engineer X as an employee of firm Y under the circumstances described? In other words, is it ethical for engineer Z to continue passing out these brochures that list engineer X as a hydrology expert on their staff when in fact she's moving on to another firm? Think about it for a second. You might think that this is unethical. You might think that it's ethical. The big thing to note is that there's a lot to say on it. Here is just a snippet of the analysis that the Board of Ethical Review gives. This isn't the full analysis. This, in fact, is just part of the analysis. And in particular, the analysis, I don't know if you can read this, but this analysis is comparing to a prior case that they reviewed, case 83.1. So in 83.1, there was another engineer who was a key employee, and then the firm continued to represent the engineer as part of the staff. The big difference is that in the 83.1 case, the engineer was a key employee, whereas in 90.4 case, the engineer is just an associate who is an expert in a field that isn't a central part of the firm's caseload. And this difference is relevant. This is a pertinent difference. The Board of Ethical Review decides. So they say, unlike BER case 83.1, we are reluctant to conclude that the actions of firm Y and engineer Z including in the name of engineer X in the firm's brochure and resume, demonstrate an intent to enhance the firm's qualification and work. In other words, it doesn't seem to the Board of Ethical Review that in the current case, in case 90.4, that the firm is intentionally misrepresenting their qualifications by continuing to have engineer Z in the brochure. Now, they make clear that they're not condoning the failure to correct the materials. They do have an obligation not to mislead their clients, and so they do have an obligation to correct those materials. However, the reality is that there's a logistic issue here about how long it takes to revise these brochures and get them to clients. So maybe you can't do it right away, but maybe you do something like you put an errata sheet that updates the firm's roster so that these kinds of updates can be included in the brochures without printing out new brochures entirely. Right? These kinds of things can be done. Maybe the firm has some obligation to do this kind of thing, but it's not a significant omission. It's not a deliberate misinformation about the firm's capacities, and the engineer still technically works with the firm for the next 2 weeks, so it's not strictly misinforming. So the Board of Ethical Review decides that firm Y did not violate their ethical obligations in continuing to use the brochure within this 2-week period. Right, so it's interesting the kinds of lots of interesting things here. One is the nuance and the subtlety with which the board is deciding these cases. Right, they're not deciding these ethical situations with a meat cleaver. They're sort of considering all the facts at play and how they matter to the interpretation of the ethical situation. Right, so I think there's some subtlety here. Maybe you agree or don't agree with this analysis, but you can decide that for yourself and maybe talk about it in the lesson. I should make clear that you should not do either case 90.4 or case 3.3 as your case study. Please do not do 90.4 or 3.3 if you do one of these cases, because I'm doing them in the lecture video. So if you do one of these cases, I'm not going to give you credit. You can select any other case but these 2 cases. But let me go over one more case. This is 2003, the third case of 2003. The facts in this case are as follows. Engineer C is retained to perform an inspection of a private residence by owner X, who suspects that there's a structural problem involving the roofing frame. Upon performing a cursory visual inspection, Engineer C concludes that indeed there is a structural deficiency because past modifications to the roof shingles added weight to the original structure that it was not designed to carry, thus overloading the original roof structure. Engineer C advises owner X to make immediate repairs, and certainly before the next snowstorm, as the significant additional roof load would likely lead to failure of the roof structure and potentially cause injury and loss of life. Engineer C offers to provide engineering services to design, prepare plans and specifications, and to file the appropriate paperwork to the municipal authorities and so on for a reasonable fee. Owner X declines Engineer C's offer to provide the design services and advises Engineer C via an email through Owner X's attorney that Engineer C should have no further involvement in the project. Several weeks pass, and Engineer C observes that no work has been done to the corrected structural deficiency in the roof. So Engineer C is called in to do an inspection, does the inspection, realizes that there is a problem that could cause potential injury. Does Engineer C have an ethical obligation to take further action? After several weeks, nothing is done. Does Engineer C have an ethical obligation to take further action? So again, there's lots of analysis. I'm not going to read all of this, but the Board of Ethical Review compares it to case 98.9. In case 98.9, there was another case where a structural engineer sees a potential problem, informs the owner, and the owner does nothing about it. But in this 98.9 case, the structural problems were with a residential structure. In case 98.9, it was a large commercial building where a large urban area where thousands of people might be affected by a potential structural failure. In the current case, in case 03.3, the property is a private residence on private property. It might also affect safety, but it'll affect safety of the owners immediately and not just the surrounding public. So maybe this isn't as dire of a public safety issue as the other case. And whether it's a serious threat to public safety or whether it's just a threat to the private owner makes a difference to how the board decides these cases. They think that this is a relevant difference. This is a relevant difference, and because of this difference, the obligations on Engineer C are different. Now, the Board of Ethical Review says it seems clear that the Engineer C is obligated to take some action on behalf of the public interest. But unlike this prior case, the board does not think that the facts require immediate reporting of the structural deficiencies to public authorities. So the Board of Ethical Review says something should be done about it, but maybe it doesn't require whistleblowing just yet. Maybe there are other steps that you can take. For instance, maybe you can inform the attorney that there is an important safety issue and that maybe they should get a second opinion from another engineer, something to confirm that, in fact, this is a genuine concern. In other words, this is a case that does require further action, but further action that doesn't go to the length of whistleblowing, whistleblowing going outside of standard operating channels and going to an authority who can do something about it. In this case, there is a safety concern, but maybe that safety concern just warrants going back to the owner, reiterating the concern, asking the attorney to maybe get a second opinion to confirm the concern, and so on. Right? These are things, pleas that you can make to the owner to go back to the safety challenge, and maybe that's the engineer's obligation in this case. So there is further action obligated, but not whistleblowing to authorities. This may be just reinforming the owner of the risks involved. All right, so again, I think this is a sort of subtle analysis. It's not just ethics with the meat cleaver. They're actually doing some careful analysis. That doesn't mean that they're always right. Pick a case yourself. See what you think. Give it some consideration. I'm interested to read your posts. The last thing I want to talk about briefly for this lesson is an extra credit assignment you have. So this extra credit assignment will be due in a few weeks. You can see the due dates on Moodle. The assignment is for a roughly 500-word post, which is about the length of a normal post in the discussion forums. But I want you to post this in the extra credit forum, which is at the top of Moodle in the first section right next to the syllabus. If you use research, and you should probably do some research for this, I want you to include a bibliography for your extra credit assignment. This extra credit assignment, if you turn it in by the due date, will be worth 20 points, or roughly a quiz. So if you didn't do so hot in a quiz, or if you've been losing points in other places, this can help you recover some of those points. And the assignment is to talk about the ethics of your field. So we just went over the NSPE Code of Ethics, which is a very general, sort of generic kind of ethical code. You can see in your textbook in Appendix B, there's lots of the other professional engineering society ethical codes, including the Code of Ethics for mechanical engineers, automotive engineers, software engineers, civil engineers, and so on. All of these different disciplines have slightly different ethical concerns, or maybe focus of ethical concern. All of them are concerned, first and foremost, with the safety, health, and welfare of the public, but maybe different ethical challenges arise in these different in these different engineering fields. And so your assignment is to do some research about what that exactly amounts to. Find the ethical codes, regulations, policies, standards that govern your field. And by your field, I mean maybe your major, or maybe the career path you're planning on taking. Maybe it's just a field that you want to get into or have some interest in, that you want to talk about how it differs from the general NSPE Code of Ethics that we've been talking about so far this semester. Right, so look up alternative ethical codes, the ethical codes for different professional societies. If you're going into like biomedical ethics, maybe not the biomedical field, maybe not as an engineer, but maybe as a biologist or a biochemist or something. Maybe though there are ethical concerns in those fields that differ from what we've talked about. Look up what how the codes are different. Maybe look up a few important case studies from these different fields to help illuminate your discussion. Your assignment shouldn't be just the case study, and you shouldn't be doing case studies that we've already talked about, but try to do some novel case studies that get into the details and the specific to your field. Also, if you have any work experience in the field, if you have contacts or other kind of special knowledge of the field that you'd like to share with the class, just to help people understand ethics in your career specifically. So like I said, this should be a 500-word post. If you are using outside sources, give it a full bibliography. If you turn it in by the due date, you get 20 points. After that due date, I'm going to continue accepting this assignment till the end of the semester, but I'm going to take 5 points off of total credit, so that if you do it in the next few weeks, you get that sort of 5-point bonus. All this is extra credit. If you don't have to do it. If you don't do it, it doesn't count against your grade. But if you're worried about your grade points, the points in your grade, you can go ahead and do this assignment and come up with a bit of extra points. Look at the syllabus for more details about the grading policy, about the syllabus, about the extra credit policy. And that's it. Thank you very much. I will see you all next week. Bye.